Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
A newly released report has found the Philippines' territorial expansion attempts in the South China Sea undermine international legal system. NATO leaders have gathered in Ankara amid growing rifts over defense spending and security priorities. And Iran and the United States trade fire, and Trump calls the ceasefire into question. Welcome to World Today, a news program with a different perspective. I'm Anna in Beijing. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. Our top story. A newly released report has found that the Philippines' territorial claims and actions in the South China Sea undermine the international legal order and pose a threat to regional peace and stability. The report, titled Historical and Legal Critique of the Philippines' Territorial Claims in the South China Sea, argues that Manila's claim over Huangyandao and several islands and reefs in the Nansha Islands lack historical and legal basis and are inconsistent with international law. The report came amid rising tensions fueled by the recent Philippine and Japanese activities, and again the backdrop of the 10th anniversary of China's rejection of an arbitration ruling that Manila continues to cite in support of its maritime claims. So for more on this, joining us on the line is Liu Kuangyu, researcher at Institute of Taiwan Studies, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Kuangyu, let's start with the report itself. Given the Philippines' recent provocations in the South China Sea, its repeated invocation of the 2016 South China Sea arbitration, and its efforts to involve extra regional powers in the region, what do you think this report is really trying to set straight? And what are the biggest facts that have long been misrepresented or deliberately blurred in the Philippine narrative?
The primary objective of this report is to systematically restore the complete historical, legal truth of the South China Sea issue and fundamentally refute the Philippines' one-sided, distorted narrative and correct long-standing cognitive biases within the international community caused by the Philippine side. I think the report aims to clarify core facts in two dimensions. Historically, China has discovered, named, exploited, and administered the Nanhai Islands or Nanhai Judao since the Han and Tang and Song dynasties, with very abundant detailed records in official maps, shipping logs, and governance documents, successive dynasties. And after that, post-World War II international instruments, including the Cairo Declaration and Potsdam Proclamation, explicitly returned all South China Sea islands to China, while the Philippines only put forward its groundless claims in the 1970s, and after that, running counter to historical timelines. And legally, the 2016 arbitration, so-called, is fatally flawed in adjudication and procedure, and rendering this award null and void with no binding force. The Philippines' attempt to deny other states territorial sovereignty by exclusive economic zones violates the basic logic of the UN clause, and the Philippines has long served millennia of historical context, evaded the post-war international consensus, and overstated by the validity of the arbitral award and blurred the line between territorial sovereignty over maritime features and maritime rights, and concealed its legal occupations. So this report systematically supplements the full evidence to present objective facts.
Then to be more specific, we know the Philippines usually makes two main arguments. One is that these features fall within its exclusive economic zone. The second is the 2016 South China Sea Arbitration Award. So how does this report respond to those claims? And are there any international treaties or legal principles that clearly establish these maritime features do not belong to the Philippines?
Yeah. On its first argument that maritime features within this so-called 200 nautical mile EEZ belong to the Philippines, this report clarified that the EEZ is a concept of maritime rights and cannot override territorial sovereignty over the land features. This is common sense international laws on the sea. And UN clause stipulates that territorial sovereignty over land constitutes the precondition for delimiting maritime rights. And one cannot reverse the logic of size. The long established land features simply by virtue of surrounding maritime zones. And China had established sovereignty over the Nanhai Islands and thousands of years ago, and long before the Philippines' independence and creation of the so-called EEZ regime, making Manila's reasoning logically inverted. And regarding the second reliance on the 26th Arbitral Award, the report proves that the tribunal exceeded its jurisdiction by hearing sovereignty disputes, which fall outside UN clause arbitration scope. We see the severe unfairness marred arbitrator selection and evidence evaluation, and China has never recognized or implemented this invalid award. And multiple binding international documents confirm these maritime features do not belong to Philippines. We mentioned the Cairo Declaration and Potsdam Proclamation required Japan to return all the South China Sea island they seized back to China, and the 1947 Philippine Constitution and their own official maps never incorporated relevant reefs into Philippine territory, and numerous bilateral and multilateral post-war treaties also affirm China's inherent sovereignty over the Nanhai Islands.
Then about China's position, are there any historical records, including, records dating back centuries as well as post-Second World War international arrangements that can demonstrate China's long-standing administration and jurisdiction over these islands and reefs?
Yeah, China's sovereignty over the South China Sea islands plus our related maritime rights in these waters, we can stretch back over thousands of years. For example, we see records from the Eastern Han Dynasty, the records of strange things, or Yi Wu Zhi, first documented Chinese activity here in South China Sea, and the Northern Song Dynasty, which is around 1,000 years ago, and China deployed naval troops to patrol the South China Sea. And between 1405 and 1433, over 28 years, the Ming Dynasty sent Zheng He, the famous pilot, on the official voyages, leading China's fleet to sail across the South China Sea. And more than 5,000 years ago, many local fishermen created handwritten navigation manuals called Genglubu, which they still use to today. And we also have solid international historical references. The 1868 British guide, the so-called China Sea Directory, 1993 French publication called Illustrated Colonial World. All these records deliver one clear truth, that China was the first nation to discover, to name, and develop the South China Sea islands and surrounding waters. And for thousands of years, China have peacefully, continuously, and effectively exercised full sovereignty and jurisdiction here. And our sovereignty and maritime rights were built step by step, with long history and backed by rock-solid historical and legal proof. And we see also two key documents, the post-World War II international order, that is the Cairo Declaration and Potsdam Proclamation. They clearly rule that all territories Japan stole from China must be returned, and this includes the South China Sea Islands. This laid a solid legal foundation for China to take by Xisha and Nansha Islands and restore full territorial control after this war. And also, once Japan surrendered in 1945, the Chinese government sent naval squadrons in 1946 to formally recover the Dongsha, Xisha, and Nansha Islands and fully resuming sovereignty over the entire South China Sea island chain. And in 1 year later, China's Executive Yuan, the Chinese government then put all four archipelagos, Dongsha, Xisha, Zhongsha, Nansha, under the Guangdong province administration, and also in our official administrative map. So this is the complete procedure of our recovery of the islands. And also after that, the San Francisco Treaty, although we don't recognize the clauses, but Japan's consistent official stance after this treaty, and also with the treaty with China, they all include this the bilateral peace treaty between Japan and also Taiwan, all confirm that sovereignty over Xisha and Nansha was already fully returned to China.
But many people tend to mix up maritime rights with territorial sovereignty. So, where exactly is the line, and what rights does the Philippines legitimately have under international law, and where does it infringe upon China's territorial sovereignty?
Based on legal framework laid out in this report, we can see that the core criterion to distinguish the Philippines' lawful maritime rights from its illegal claims infringing China's sovereignty is the principle of land sovereignty prevails, strictly consistent with the international logic viewing clause. On one hand, the Philippines enjoy legitimate maritime rights such as easy and also continental shelves under international law, but provided it does not violate other states' established territorial sovereignty over land features. The Philippines hold exclusive rights to resource exploration, fishery, and maritime science research within its EEZ, include extending from its maritime coast. But China has never denied these universally recognized lawful maritime entitlements. On the other hand, the Philippines' excessive claim beyond the international law contain two fatal flaws. First, they ignore the well-established historical and legal facts confirming China's sovereignty over the Nansha Islands, like what I described just now. And second, it uses alleged maritime rights as the pretext to occupy reefs and build illegal facilities, and essentially violating China's territorial sovereignty. Here, dividing line exists between two concepts. Maritime rights apply only to water columns and seabed resources and cannot extend to territorial lands on lands and reefs, while territorial sovereignty holds supreme legal standing. States' maritime rights can erode another country's established land sovereignty, and the Philippines deliberately confuses two concepts and carries out territorial occupation under the guise of maritime rights in total contradiction to the entire international law of the sea regime.
As you mentioned, the Philippines' historical borders have never included any of China's South China Sea islands. Manila only began asserting those claims over parts of China's Nansha Islands and Huangyandiao starting in the 1970s. So why do you think Manila has continued expanding its claims and bringing outside military powers into the region? What impact could this have on regional security, ASEAN unity, and the common interests of coastal states?
Yeah, I think there might be three core motives. The first is the Philippines' attempt to counterbalance China by external military forces to make up for its insufficient maritime military capacity. Relying on foreign allies to back its legal occupation or reefs. And second, it seeks to multilateralize and internationalize the bilateral territorial disputes, try to hijack regional agendas and gain some diplomatic leverage from major power rivalry and dilute China's natural regional advantages in the South China Sea. Third, driven by domestic politics, the Philippines government hyped South China Sea tensions to divert public attention away from its own domestic economic and livelihood crisis with trying to win some domestic political support. And this practice yields severe adverse consequences for regional security. Frequent deployments and joint military drills by outside powers escalate risks of maritime confrontation and accidental clashes, and undermining overall peace and stability in South China Sea. And for ASEAN unity, this community and outside interference split its internal ASEAN consensus, forcing some member states to take sides and weakening ASEAN's central role, independence, and autonomy. For shared interests of coastal states, the maritime militarization, rivalry, dispute, fishery, shipping and oil gas cooperation, and so on, and thus damage dialogue channels for negotiated dispute settlements, and will fuel regional arms races, gravely harm the shared development and security interests of all South China Sea coastal nations, and running counter to the core spirit of negotiation and reconciliation embodied in the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties of the South China Sea.
That was Liu Kuangyu, researcher at Institute of Taiwan Studies at Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. NATO has launched a new initiative aimed at channeling private capital into its defense and security sectors. The call to action announced during NATO's first Defense Industry Forum alongside its summit in Ankara urges commercial financial institutions to increase lending and equity investments in military and security production. Major financial institutions, including Barclays, Citi, and Deutsche Bank, have joined the initiative. Also at the forum, U.S. President Donald Trump said he's disappointed with the NATO allies regarding the conflict in Iran. He said Washington will lift sanctions on Turkey and consider bringing Ankara back into the F-35 fighter jet program. So to delve into this, let's have Dr. George Zougopoulos, Director of EU-China Programs and a Senior Research Fellow at European Institute of Nice. Thanks for joining us, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
Professor, let's start with the summit. NATO has unveiled a new initiative to mobilize private capital for the defense industry and endorsed the target of raising defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. But we've already seen disagreements over how and even whether that can be achieved. So how realistic are these new commitments?
Now that we are talking, the final statement has not yet been issued, so we can discuss a few things as you suggested, but we have to wait for the final statement. You correctly pointed out that member states of NATO have committed to spend 5% of their GDP on defense. This is a commitment made last year during the NATO summit organized in the Netherlands, and now they are reiterating this commitment. So there are certainly discussions, especially in Europe, up to what extent this is feasible. But I would say that the factor which is currently overshadowing discussions is the one of President Donald Trump, who is putting pressure on U.S. NATO partners to spend more. And obviously there are different views, not only concerning whether this is feasible, but also up to what extent some expenses might be qualified for the ones identified by NATO or not. So discussions are ongoing, and certainly this NATO summit is largely influenced by the personality of President Trump.
Mm-hmm. Professor, under such discussions, let's talk more about the big development that NATO's effort to bring private capital into the defense industry. Banks are now being encouraged to invest more in military production. Do you think this could end up, making the arms industry even more profit-driven and potentially increase the risk of conflict?
Well, what is happening is that European Union member states are paying more for defense in the last years, especially since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. And there are different European projects which are placed in this context. So the new initiative, as you correctly pointed out, is another step toward the same direction, which is for EU member states, which are also some of them, they're vast majority members of NATO, to pay more on defense projects. And for this to happen, the new idea includes also the leverage to come through a bank, which has been proposed, and through private capital. Up to what extent this will happen, we have to wait and see for the final statement to be issued in Ankara. But generally speaking, this is linked to the trend which has been already clear and evident over the last couple of years, and especially since President Trump came to power.
Mm-hmm. Another major issue at the summit involved Turkey. President Trump has suggested lifting sanctions and even allowing Turkey back into the F-35 program. Israel has reportedly reacted with concern. How significant is this move, and what ripple effects could it have across the region?
A couple of years ago, during the first Trump presidency, the military collaboration between Turkey and Russia led the American administration to impose some sanctions against Turkey. And right now, the debate is revolved around whether these sanctions might be lifted or not. The president of the United States, Donald Trump, seems prepared to play a role in order for the sanctions to be lifted. But finally, it is the U.S. Congress which will have to decide on this policy. So we have to wait and see up to what extent this is possible or not. But certainly, as you correctly pointed out, there are other Middle East countries like Israel, which are not favorably looking into the determination of the American president to put pressure on the Congress to lift the sanctions. Israel believes that the qualitative superiority in terms of its military should not change in the Middle East, and that's why it is not supporting the new policy of the American president. We have to wait and see, because President Trump tends to overemphasize on several policies in some public remarks, but it does not necessarily mean that this is followed by action.
Mm-hmm. Professor, support for Ukraine was another major issue, because we know since 2022, NATO members have provided extensive military assistance to Ukraine, but differences inside Europe are growing. For example, Slovakia says it won't contribute to more military funding. More broadly, European countries appear increasingly divided over long-term support for Ukraine. So given domestic economic pressures and shifting public opinion, do you believe NATO members are able to sustain this level of support? And what does this summit reflect about the future trajectory of the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Well, I would say that it largely depends on the American policy, because certainly the role of NATO is interwoven into the United States and the American strategy. For now, and despite the efforts of President Trump to mediate, and despite the fact that he is much more balanced in comparison to his predecessor as far as the Ukraine crisis is concerned, the United States military policy and military support vis-a-vis Ukraine has not changed. And this is an important remark that we need to make. As far as Europe is concerned, I would say that certainly there are some member states of the European Union which are more skeptical. Slovakia, you mentioned this. At the same time, however, there are other countries like Hungary, which with the new prime minister seem more determined to collaborate with the European Commission in the support of Ukraine. As far as Europe is concerned, I would say that there is much skepticism concerning not necessarily the military support vis-a-vis Ukraine, but the quality of the military shipments which are being made in support of Ukraine. Again, I go back to my main point that it largely depends on the American strategy. The European Union is an important actor, but it is a secondary actor as far as Ukraine is concerned.
Thanks, Professor, for those insightful analysis. That was Dr. George Zougopoulos, Director of EU-China Programs and a Senior Research Fellow at European Institute of Nice. More to come. Iran and the United States trade fire, and Trump called the ceasefire into question. U.S. job growth slowed more than expected in June. Chinese AI models lead OpenRouter's traffic among global developers, surpassing their Western competitors. You are listening to Road Today. We'll be back after a short break. You've been listening to Road Today with me, Anna, in Beijing. The United States has launched a new round of airstrikes on Iran, claiming it's a response to Iranian attacks on commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz. Washington has also reinstated sanctions on Iran's oil sector. The U.S. President Donald Trump says the ceasefire with Iran is over. Iran has condemned the U.S. moves, saying they seriously violate the memorandum signed in June. Tehran also warned against any U.S. interference in the Strait of Hormuz, saying the routes set by Iran are the only safe passage for tankers and merchant ships. For more on this, my colleague Gao Yingshi spoke with Dr. Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University.
The United States says the ceasefire is still in effect, yet it has just launched its largest strikes since the memorandum was signed in June. How do you read this approach from Washington?
Well, I think that is not surprising from my point of view, because when the United States signed the Memorandum of Understanding, it did not intend to completely stop military operations, because we can see that the military deployments around Iran have not yet been withdrawn. And the continued deployment of all these military forces around Iran means that greater military expenditures are spent. So retaining them means that the United States has made two front preparations, and so it may escalate the conflict again at any time. And currently, the issue here is that neither side has enough trust towards the other side, and the negotiations between the two sides are at an impasse. Nobody wants to make a real compromise at this stage. And in addition, also both sides are carrying out political mobilization in their own countries. And the National Day celebrations in the United States are also over. Therefore, the United States wants to force Iran to make more concessions by increasing pressure on Iran.
Washington has also revoked the 60-day authorization for Iran's oil production and sales. How much pressure will this put on Iran's economy, and could this push Tehran toward further escalation?
Obviously, that is what I think, because currently we know so far Iran has already suffered from great economic difficulties and losses. And this action will exacerbate fiscal pressures, currency depreciation, and also inflation in Iran. And actually, that directly counters the economic relief envisioned in the Memorandum of Understanding's interim phase. So in the short term, I think this could reduce Iran's oil export volumes. And actually, this has already disrupted by Hormuz incidents. Also, it could hit the government budgets in Iran and the IRGC's operational flexibility to a great extent. I think furthermore, the worrisome issue, as you have already mentioned, is that this could also trigger an escalation of confrontation between the two sides, because so far both sides are trying to emphasize that they get an upper hand in this struggling and power wrestling. So Tehran may respond asymmetrically by, for instance, pushing its allies in the region to act, or it could also further Hormuz closure or accelerate the posturing regarding the nuclear issue in order to raise costs for the United States and force further concessions from the other side. And in the end, this could also affect global economy.
Currently, Iran insists that the roads it sets are the only safe passage through the Straits of Hormuz and warns against any foreign interference. What is Tehran trying to achieve with this position?
I think for Iran, it always wants to show the United States and the international society that it still has some bargaining chips. And right now, Tehran is trying to leverage its geographic location to extract further leverage in negotiations. So by designating the so-called safe routes and requiring coordination and permits, I think Iran seeks formal recognition of its role in the maritime management. Also, it tries to negotiate with the United States to say that it wants to further take fees or for services in this strait. And also it tries to exclude the non-littoral powers' permanent military presence. So I think by taking such a very hardline position, it tries to show the United States that it still has its own power and leverage, and also it tries to deter the American and Israeli operations, and also it tries to generate revenue and political capital post-conflict because it always states that it has already suffered from a huge loss during this conflict. And last but not least, I think it also tries to bolster deterrence and regime legitimacy domestically.
And for now, we have already seen the conflict spilling over. Air defense alerts in Kuwait and Bahrain, and reports of attacks near the U.S. military facilities in the region. So, how likely this is going to be a wider regional confrontation?
Well, I would say that so far the conflict has not ended, and spillover is already occurring. The regional confrontation is there, with Iranian retaliatory strikes targeting the United States-linked sites in its neighboring countries, such as Kuwait and Bahrain. And I think a full, wider confrontation remains possible, but not inevitable in the short term. So currently, we should see that mutual interest in avoiding total economic collapse is there. And both for the regional powers and Iran and also the United States, nobody wants to see a real escalation of the conflict again and see the economic blow and also higher oil prices. So I think they are trying to minimize the effect. And also as for the United States and Iran, I think both sides are trying to take a hardliner position in order to push the other side to make more compromise in these negotiations, but they still want to preserve talks. So I think there is still the possibility of a further confrontation of this conflict, and that could lead to a wider regional confrontation. But I think so far as all these actors know that this is in the interest of nobody, so they are trying to prevent this kind of scenario from happening.
And despite the strikes, the United States says it will continue negotiations with Iran for the final deal. Is diplomacy still possible at this point? And what would it take to bring both sides back to the table?
Well, I think diplomacy remains possible, but the problem is that it's highly uncertain and unpredictable. If we want to see real progress in these ongoing negotiations, then there are some key requirements for further progress. For instance, there needs to be mutual compliance mechanism because there needs to be, for instance, clear deconfliction on the Hormuz routes and also the verifiable window of attacks, for instance. And also for the United States side, it needs to do more of its concessions, and it also needs to keep its promises. For instance, United States sanctions relief calibrated to Iranian restraint that should be taken into consideration. And also there needs to be broader regional buy-in. For instance, the Gulf security issue needs to be addressed, and also there should be a real de-escalation of the conflict between Lebanon and Israel. But so far, the problem is that Iran and the United States, since they lack trust towards the other side, so they both require the other side to take the first steps in concessions. So without swift de-escalation on the ground, and given that the key and crucial disagreements between the two sides are very hard to be mitigated, the cycle of strikes could still derail the final deal.
That was Dr. Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University, speaking with my colleague Gao Yingxu. Coming up, U.S. job growth slowed more than expected in June. This is World Today. We'll be back.
Hello, I'm Yin Liang, Kramer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. In a rapidly changing world, staying informed has never been more important. World Today delivers sharp analysis, global perspectives, and the stories behind the headlines. It is your trusted source to understand what's shaping our world. World Today, bringing the world closer.
You've been listening to Road Today. The latest U.S. jobs report has raised fresh questions about the strength of the American economy. Employer added just 57,000 jobs in June, well below expectations, while payroll gains for April and May were revised lower. The unemployment rate fell to 4.2%, largely because 720,000 people left the labor force, pushing participation to a 5-year low. Leisure and hospitality sector shed 61,000 jobs, despite hopes that the FIFA World Cup tournament would boost hiring. So for more on this, my colleague Zhao Yang spoke with Yan Liang, professor of economics at Willamette University.
Yeah, and the U.S. economy added just 57,000 jobs in June. This is roughly half of what economists expected. So what do you think are the main reasons behind it? Is it simply a one-week month, or does it signal a broader slowdown in the U.S. economy, do you think?
Well, yeah, I think this signal a sharply cooling U.S. labor market, which I think caught many economists by surprise. But when you think about it, there are three main reasons behind the slowdown. One has to do with the geopolitical reasons and the energy shock. So because of the energy shock due to the Middle East conflict, this has risen the energy prices and also the broader price increase, which forced consumers to scale back on the discretionary spending. And so I think that prompted businesses to reduce and freeze their hiring. And the second reason connected to that is, as I mentioned earlier, because of this kind of discretionary spending scale back, you see the hospitality and leisure, these job openings have dropped by 61,000 in June. And so that really, I think, is what prompts many businesses to think twice to hire. And because leisure and hospitality industry has been the big job sector, and so that really is a big impact. And the third reason is because of policy uncertainty, because Trump administration has been on and off playing the tariff card. And I think that also put the businesses in a very difficult position. So they are holding off business expansions. And the last reason is because I think there has been a shrinking labor force. And we can talk about that, but there have been over 700,000 people exiting the labor force. And so that's why I think, again, it shows the labor market, even though the employment rate did not climb up very drastically, but still that means the labor market has been in this very low hiring situation. And so that is not conducive for more jobs. Now, when you ask whether this is just, one-time blip or is a broader trend, I think the difficulty here is you saw the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they also slashed an additional 74,000 jobs from April and May data. So this major downward revision indicate that this is probably not just 1 month of abnormal change. It seems to say that this kind of hiring momentum was much weaker already earlier heading into the summer. So that I think indicate it's probably not just a monthly blip.
You mentioned the leisure and hospitality sector lost a lot of jobs despite the summer travel season and people's hopes that the FIFA World Cup tournament would boost hiring. So what does this tell us about the U.S. consumer spending?
Right. So that's exactly the point. I think that because of the energy crisis, because of rising inflation, U.S. consumers would have to spend a lot more on their basic needs, right? So in terms of transportation, food, energy, and so that means that they have to cut on the discretionary spending, which is for the leisure and hospitality spending. And so those are usually, a big sector to offer jobs. And so with this low, U.S. consumer confidence and their spending on discretionary items, then that's why we're seeing the sector is shedding jobs, which is very, unhelpful for the overall labor market pictures. And I think that coupled with other factors, That's why we're seeing that this usually historical robust sector now is hitting a wall.
And you also mentioned the U.S. is entering a low hire, low fire economy. So why is that?
Well, I think from the demand side, when you look at the businesses, they don't want to fire in a massive amount, partly because following the post-pandemic labor shortages of 2021 and 2022, companies started, they spend a lot of time and capital recruiting workers. So now even when the economy cools, they're hesitant to lay off their workers. So they're hoarding their existing employees. But at the same time, they don't want to expand their payroll, partly because the interest rate is high, there is the elevated inflation, there is a shifting tariff policies, there is the low confidence in the consumer spending. All of this made corporate executives risk averse. So they don't want to hire, but they don't want to fire. Now, from the labor supply side, I think employees, they also no longer want to voluntarily quitting the jobs to take on better jobs because they're also worried about, the labor market situations. So the voluntary so-called quit rates has fallen back to the historical lows. So that means, workers are not willing to make changes and the employers are not willing to fire or hire. And that's what results in this low fire and low hire situation.
And some economists also mentioned an uncertainty tax. So what's your view? And how much are tariffs, trade policy, and the geopolitical tensions influencing the hire decisions today? How much uncertainty are U.S. businesses facing?
So the level of uncertainty is immense. So as you mentioned, there are a couple of factors that elevate uncertainty. There's the geopolitical tensions. As we know, the so-called peace deal between the United States and Iran is really on and off. So it's really uncertain whether or not this kind of conflict is going to drag on and whether or not the Strait of Hormuz will remain open smoothly. So that adds to the uncertainty when it comes to energy prices and therefore the inflation situation. And there's also the tariff policy. As we know that Trump administration has undergone 2 rounds of the Section 301 investigations. And so it's likely that the tariff rate is going to be increased, but whether or not, whether that can stand any legal challenges and whether or not other countries would retaliate and whether or not the Trump administration will continue to push on more tariffs, all of this would impose, extra uncertainty on businesses. And then with all these, the inflation situation would then also lead to different interest rate policies the Fed is considering. So all of this would add to business uncertainties, which makes them a lot more, risk averse. So they would hold off any, major decisions about expansion. Not to mention, I think a lot of the emphasis now for the businesses are put on AI cap expenditure. And that means they may not want to hire more workers if they believe that AI is going to help to boost productivity and replace some of the workforce. So all of this would then drag on the labor market. So I think that makes the labor market situation difficult.
And you talk about artificial intelligence, and that is also changing the way companies hire, especially the entry-level jobs and managed workers as well. So are we already seeing AI reshape the labor market? And if so, what do you think is the biggest labor market trend moving forward for business leaders?
Well, I think that we're already seeing AI affecting the labor market, especially in certain sectors like tech. But rather than, triggering a massive wave of very visible, high-profile mass layoffs, again, except in some of the tech firms, I think generative AI and agentic workflow are changing labor market in a subtle way. So for one I think that the AI is enhancing labor market productivity in certain sectors. Again, for example, computer programming and some other more repetitive but routine tech work. And so that tends to replace some of the existing workers. But instead of laying off these workers, I think that the companies are simply freeze some of the new hirings. So in other words, they're squeezing some of the entry level and young workers. When you look at the Federal Reserve of Dallas, they published a research that showed the employment of younger workers has notably declined in occupations with very heavy AI exposure. So that is a sign that AI can automate routine and also early career tasks. Like I mentioned, basic coding, content drafting, and data filtering. Then the companies would then skip those entry-level hiring and prioritize more highly experienced senior level professionals. And so I think that is one trend that we're likely to see, that the entry-level jobs are going to be tight, but there's still needs for some of the more higher skilled, higher level of jobs. But that said, because of the workers need to be retrained, we'll likely see this kinds of labor market mismatch. So on the one hand, there are still job openings, but on the other hand, there may not be workers that are qualified, especially the young and newly graduate workers, that they'll not be able to qualify for certain jobs.
That was Yan Liang, professor of economics at Willamette University.
Welcome. I'm Elaf Elad, economics professor and member of the Data Science and AI Center at New York University, Shanghai. On the World Today program, you can find in-depth and impartial insight, as well as critical commentary on key trends in the Chinese economy, financial technology, business, and blockchain. To prepare for the world tomorrow, join me on World Today.
Chinese AI models are rapidly gaining global traction among developers. According to data from OpenRouter, the model routing marketplace, Chinese models from Xiaomi, Alibaba, DeepSeek, Minimax, and Moonshot now account for more than 45% of all traffic, up from less than 2% just a year ago. 4 of the platform's top 5 models by token volume come from Chinese companies, overtaking many established Western competitors. OpenAI's share, meanwhile, stands at around 7.5%. So more on this, we're joined by Dr. Shaoshan Liu, Director of Embodied Intelligence at Shenzhen Institute of Artificial Intelligence and Robotics for Society. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Liu.
Well, thank you for having me.
The numbers are really striking. Just a year ago, Chinese models made up less than 2% of OpenRouter traffic. Now they about 45%, and 4 of the platform's top 5 models are Chinese. So what's behind this dramatic shift? And beyond competitive pricing, what do you see as the key advantages that are driving growing adoption among U.S. developers and enterprises?
Well, I think it's a very good trend. At the high level, the trend shows that Chinese models are gaining momentum in the global market share, and that's extremely important. Remember, China and US are the 2 leading countries in terms of AI, but then China and US consist of about 18% or about 20% of the world population. That means the rest 70-something percent would decide which model would be the most popular. And one of the key metrics they use is OpenRouter. OpenRouter allow people to connect to different models through API. And the trend there is very clear because it's not just the quality of the model, it's how much you pay for the model as well per token. And that's the basic economic unit in the future. It's how much token you can use and what price you pay for the tokens. I think in terms of quality and the combination of quality and cost, Chinese models are gaining a lot of tractions today.
We know DeepSeek and Alibaba are names many people already know, but Xiaomi's Mimo really surprised a lot of people, right? It launched quietly and then quickly shot up the rankings. Tell us a bit more about this model and what does this success say about how Chinese AI companies are competing overseas?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. Let's put aside the model technical detail for a while, but let's focus on why Xiaomi is doing it, right? The competition in the US is Apple. Apple is not doing too much on releasing their own models. But Xiaomi's business model is a bit different from Apple. Apple mainly sells phones, Mac, but Xiaomi is IoT companies in the sense that in the future, there are devices that in your home that could be using the Xiaomi brand. The cell phone could be the Xiaomi brand, and the car is Xiaomi brand. So it's connecting everything. Behind this connection, it's the model that powering all these different devices. And I think that's why Xiaomi invests heavily on model development, which is the right move. And if we talk about the model itself, they have a very good team. They acquired team from top talent from different companies. And then the model itself, it's not a small model. People would imagine usually from this IoT company, they try to push model that's a small, they can run on devices. They push a very big model, 1 trillion parameters MOE model with long context, with tremendous performance off the chart. So I think if we focus on why they do it and what this thing would go, it's very interesting. Imagine in the future, a company, whether it's Xiaomi or Honor or Huawei, all these companies are IoT companies. They have a very strong model powering all different devices that they provide. That's a very smart way of living, and that's a Chinese way of living that we can show the world. You can live your life in a very different way.
That's very interesting. And we know it seems that China and the US are taking two very different paths. American companies tend to focus on closed source models, while Chinese firms are pushing open source ecosystems. How would you compare these two approaches with today more folks put on tokens?
Well, I think that's an interesting question as well, because if you examine the technology history, open source almost always wins. Back then, when we talk about the PC era, there's Linux, there's Windows. Then Linux gained a lot of traction because it's open source. Then in the mobile phone era, I think Android is a huge campaign versus Apple. So open source, there's a way to reach people with open source. So I think open source is the right way to go. And people often say the US models are premium and the Chinese model are low cost. I don't see it that way. It's all about market share at this point. Remember, there's 78% of people who live outside of either China or United States. The current priority is to capture the market size. If you can capture more market share, then you can gradually upgrade your model to have better performance, better cost, and better user experience. Then your model will become the standard, especially if it's open source. It's easy for people to adopt that standard. And once you have the standard, then you have the whole market. So I think open source is definitely the right move at this point.
1 minute to go. One thing that's really interesting about this open source ecosystem, Chinese models have already inspired more than 100,000 models on Hugging Face, with the developers around the world building on top of them. So how do you look at this momentum?
Well, I think the competition is different. In China, there are a lot of startups focusing on building large language models. Not only startups, but the big firms, they all bet on this. But if you look at the US, it's mainly Gemini from Google and Anthropic and OpenAI. There's 3 giants there. So the competition is more fierce in China. So we will see under the fierce competition, you will drive more innovation. We will see more interesting products on the markets very soon in the next year or so.
Thanks for those valuable insights. That was Dr. Shaoshan Liu, Director of Embodied Intelligence at Shenzhen Institute of Artificial Intelligence and Robotics for Society. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. I'm Glenna in Beijing. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.